Milí přátelé, chtěli bychom vám sdělit
Dear friends, we would like to share some information with you about two diseases, leprosy and syphilis, which influenced the population of Europe in the last millennium.
Populace v Evropě v minulém tisíciletí. Kolem těchto chorob existuje.
There are a number of mysteries relating to these diseases, mainly relating to the origin of syphilis, which need to be solved. And so, the Institute for the History of Medicine at Charles University paired with the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine of the University of Zurich to investigate.
S Ústavem evoluční medicíny Univerzity v Zurichu. Výzkum zahrnoval sběr.
The research involved the collection of bone samples from ossuaries in Bohemia and Moravia, and also from museums. These samples were dated at the Poznan Radiocarbon Laboratory, and then sent on to the University of Zurich to undergo genomic analysis.
Zaslány na Univerzitu v Zurichu, kde byly provedené genomické analýzy. Lepra působila hlavně na počátku.
Leprosy was mainly active at the beginning of the last millennium, in connection with the Crusades, and because it has a long incubation period of around 3 years, it made its way to Europe with the soldiers who had travelled to fight in these wars. As a consequence of this development, more than 10,000 leper colonies were established in Europe in the 13th century.
Syphilis
first emerged at the end of the 15th century, and in the 16th century, leper colonies are suddenly transformed into hospitals for syphilitic patients.
V současné době máme 21. století a obě choroby.
Currently, we are in the 21st century, and both of these illnesses are present in the population, though they could have been eradicated. Medicines for them exist, but they have become a de facto social problem. In 500 years of the evolution of syphilis, more than 25 generations of medical practitioners have seen it, and each a little differently, because in the 16th century, bone discoveries were sparse. It was not until the 19th century that all forms of syphilis developed, including the congenital forms, and then in the 20th century, the bone discoveries diminish once again.
Se ty kostní nálezy ztrácí nebo zmenšují. První z kostních nálezů, který byl datován a který ukázal na nejčasnější.
The first of the bone discoveries which was dated and evidenced the earliest bone lesion was from the ossuary at Niškov in the Vysočina region of southeastern Bohemia. This was dated to the beginning of the 16th century, and this skull from Niškov is very significant because it indicates a journey from Hungary. In Bohemia, mention was often made of the Hungarian disease.
Dost často mluvilo o uherské nemoci. Další kostnicí, kde byly datovány.
A further ossuary from which syphilitic skulls were dated was in Mělník, in the central Bohemian region, around 30 kilometers north of Prague. Here, 4 syphilitic skulls were described and dated to the 17th and 18th century. It is evident that, at the time, syphilis was very widespread, not only among the lower and middle classes, but also among those families with roles in the administration of the state. Otto Placht discovered this and described his findings as relating to the second half of the 16th and the first half of the 17th century in his book An Estimate of the Property of the Kingdom of Bohemia from 1557. He showed that, within the span of 100 years, 69 Bohemian noble lineages were reduced to 15. Based on this finding, the historian Karel Stokal developed the theory that syphilis was involved in this reduction.
Historik Karel Stokal vytvořil teorii, že se na té redukci podílela i syfilis.
In the Anatomical Museum of Charles University's Faculty of Medicine in Hradec Králové, there is a deposit of the remains of the Bromov ossuary, which consists of 647 adult skulls and 98 skulls of children.
U lebky ženy 20 až 40 let
In the skull of a woman of between 20 to 40 years old, syphilitic changes were found mainly in the frontal region. These are numerous and start at the formation of the cribriform perforations, which ultimately join to form craters. The process ends with scarring. All of the lesions which are manifested here, from the first to the healing phases, are known under the umbrella term Hackett signs. Cecil Hackett was an Australian paleopathologist who studied syphilis and other treponema throughout the world, and who also established this precise classification of syphilis.
U některých lebek zdejších jsou charakteristické pigmentace v temenních krajinách.
Some of the skulls from this depository have pigmentation in the parietal region. This is indicative of bone pain treated with mercury. Such bone pain was very distressing. Patients at this time could only be treated with mercury, which was administered generally.
Jedině rtutí, která se podávala celkově. Ale tato léčba byla taková.
But this treatment was a blunt weapon because mercury itself is toxic. In order to limit the development of symptoms of toxicity, it was necessary, at a certain point, to cease treatment. But what was the trigger for the cessation of treatment? Nothing, until the patient's teeth started to wobble and fall out. This is why we can see that teeth have fallen out from the upper jaws of both these individuals during their lives. At the same time, perforated bone tissue is to be found both in the areas of the maxilla, the upper jaw, and the sphenoid bone, because these people had scurvy, a deficit of vitamin C. The syphilis connection from the Bromov ossary, which is located in the Institute of Anatomy in Hradec Králové, is an outstanding collection for syphilis research, not only within the Czech Republic, but also in Central Europe. Another exhibit with syphilitic changes on the skull was found in the ossuary in Bamberg, in the crypt of the church of St. Procopius of Sazava. Skull 14, with syphilitic changes in the frontal region, is the skull of a 20 to 30-year-old woman.
V čelní oblasti jsou zde změny, které způsobil.
In the frontal area, there are changes caused by the syphilitic process of desiccation, and, at the same time, there are scar-like changes indicative of the reparative process, as in the marks described by Hackett.
Známek syfilitického procesu, které popsal Hackett.
In the parietal and occipital regions, no syphilitic changes are found.
Přesně období, kdy se dostala syphilis do Bamberka, nevíme.
We do not know exactly when syphilis came to Bamberg, but when it reached Europe, according to Professor Vulček, it was such a violent disease that it left no signs on the bones whatever. People died in large numbers, particularly in Italian cities. Later, it showed up in the Czech lands.
A potom teprve se objevila později v Čechách.
We find ourselves in the anthropological department of the National Museum, where we took samples from syphilitic specimens from the Jedlička collection. Dr. Kuželka, the collection's curator, will tell us something about the Jedlička collection and how it made it to the National Museum.
Národní muzeum považuje za rok svého založení rok 1818.
The National Museum considers the year of its establishment to be 1818. That was still at a time when the famous building on Wenceslas Square had not been built, and collections were distributed across a number of places in Prague. The anthropological department of the National Museum was created as recently as 1967. It was established by Professor Vulček.
přijal do úschovny a do depozitáře.
In 1968, he accepted a part of a collection from the Second Department of Pathology, which you see in a model from 1852. It is a collection of bone and fluid specimens, primarily from the 19th century, which document both the state of medicine and the state of disease at that time.
Převážně z 19. století. Sbírka slouží jednak k výuce studentů a slouží také k výzkumu chorob, které třeba...
The collection is used to educate students and also to investigate diseases which no longer exist, such as smallpox, glanders and others. The oldest specimen is from 1830 and the most recent from 1950. It came to the National Museum as the Jedlička collection, but we have to be careful here. This is not in relation to Rudolf Jedlička, the founder of the Jedlička Institute for Disabled Children, but Václav Jedlička, the pathologist.
Zde máme kostní preparát.
Here we have a bone specimen from an 18-year-old woman who had bone lesions in the frontal region and perforations of the hard palate caused by the syphilitic process. This specimen is from the Jedlička collection. Some of the specimens, like this one, are accompanied by an autopsy report. This woman was subjected to a post-mortem examination on the 28th of September 1875, and the report tells us that there was vertebral osteolysis, inflammation of the renal pelvis, and syphilis of the liver. Her liver was filled with gummies. We can liken them to syphilitic tumours. Her brain tissue was enlarged and swollen. At the same time, there were many small, unevenly distributed necrotic deposits in the lungs, in both the right and left lobes.
Nekrotických ložisek, které zde byly nestejnoměrně rozptýleny. Jestliže chceme srovnat syfilitické léze a léze u leprosy,
if we want to compare syphilitic lesions and lesions caused by leprosy, we have a skull from Žátec in northwest Bohemia. It is mainly necessary to compare the facial region where, in cases of leprosy, the anterior nasal spine, a bony protection beneath the nasal entrance, is lost, whereas in cases of syphilis, it is preserved. Besides this, the upper jaw, maxilla, is shrunken in the facial regions where teeth are missing. These are the main differences between syphilitic and leprotic skulls.
V této oblasti. To jsou hlavní rozdíly mezi lepkou syfilitickou a lepromatózní. V kostnici ve Křtinách se nachází další unikáty, a to jsou
in the ossuary of Křtiny in South Moravia, there are some unique specimens, skulls with signs of leprosy. K303, which I'm holding in my hands, is characteristic for having expanded holes for the nerves. Leprosy affects the tissue surrounding the nerves. Here the anterior nasal spine is missing the nasal entrance. And we can also see the shrunken upper jaw with missing teeth. The hard palatal region, meanwhile, has signs of another diagnosis, namely scurvy. Our contribution was to date this skull using radiocarbon dating at the Radiocarbon Centre in Poznan, which determined that the individual died between 1039 and 1181. This would situate the death in a period encompassing the Second and Third Crusades, in which Czech soldiers participated. The other diagnosis I mentioned in relation to K303 is scurvy. This had a big influence even in the Seventh Crusade, led by Louis IX.
A zachovaly se paměti Jeana Joinville, jeho
The memoirs of Jean Joinville, a supporter of his, have survived and describe how following floods and supply failures, there was an outbreak of scurvy so bad that the soldiers' gums overgrew and they had to be cut by barbers so they could eat. And so it looked in the camps as if a host of women were giving birth because of how the soldiers were screaming.
Žen, protože tak ty vojáci křičeli. Můžeme říci, že přínos křížových výprav pro
We could say that the Crusades contributed to healthcare in two ways. Firstly, in 1309, the Villeneuve regime determined how healthcare should work in the army. And then, on the other hand, there was the matter of hospital care, because the Order of St. John, the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, began from the Second and Third Crusades to use medical hospitals in the army. Indeed, in the Third Crusade, they used mobile medical units, a very modern affair for that time. And these experiences then spread to Europe, and would later be significant both in the Middle Ages and in the modern era.
Tyto zkušenosti se potom rozšířily do Evropy a měly význam i pro zdravotnictví v pozdější době, jak ve středověku, tak novověku. Pronálezy kostnicích jsou důležité.
As far as discoveries in ossuaries are concerned, the Crusades are particularly important, since this is how leprosy came to Europe, and in particular to Central Europe. But we must also take into consideration even previous waves, first with the soldiers of Alexander the Great, and later with Avar migration when leprosy was found in Hungarian settlements. Domestically, leprosy was found in Prushanki in South Moravia in the 9th century. As far as syphilis is concerned, it is necessary to resolve whether it came to Europe with Columbus's sailors or if it originated in Europe. This would be suggested by an alternative theory which was developed on the basis of genomic studies from Lithuania. Here, during a plague pandemic, discoveries were made of both Yersinia and Treponema yaws, which, according to this new theory, may have initiated the evolution to syphilis.
Nálezy treponematozy jaws, která podle té nové teorie mohla iniciovat potom vývoj k syfilis. Všechny tyto otázky by měly být
All of these questions should be resolved with genomic analysis, and for this reason we have established this research collaboration with the University of Zurich.